What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build this live edge slab coffee table. So I used a router flattening jig to flatten this enormous slab. This is an in-grain, they call it a cookie slab. It's cut out of the tree horizontally. Also installed one of these bow tie keys, or sometimes they're called Dutchmen, and they help to stabilize the wood. As you can see, there's a pretty sizable crack in this slab, but between the base spanning this crack and the bow tie key, it should be nice and stabilized. So let's go and get started with the build.
The first step in this build is to make the router flattening jig. These jigs are really simple to make. You basically just need a sled for your router to ride on above the slab. And this sled rides on two rails, one on each side of the slab. I sized the base of the sled to be wide enough to fit the base of my router, plus the widths of the side walls of the sled. I made the base out of 1/2-inch plywood, which allowed me to get more depth without having to use a collet extension on my router. Once I knew the width I needed, I ripped the plywood to width on the table saw. For the side walls, I used 2 strips of 3/4-inch plywood glued together. Since I used 1/2-inch plywood for the bottom of the sled, I wanted to make sure it was nice and stiff. I cut the sides to length at the miter saw using some offcuts of plywood I had on hand. I glued the pieces together, added a few brad nails to hold them in place, and then added some 1.25-inch screws to tighten everything up. With the sides done, I added glue to the bottom of the sides, clamped them to the base, and then added countersunk screws from the underside of the sled. It's really important that these screws are well below the surface, as you don't want them interfering with the sled riding on the rails. Next, I needed to cut out the channel for the router bit. I marked the center of the base and then used a 2-inch Forstner bit to drill a hole on each side. Once the holes were drilled, I cut out the section between the holes using a jigsaw. This doesn't need to be very precise, as the router bit will be used to finish up this channel later on. To keep the sled from falling off the rails, I added some stops on the underside of the sled. These are just scraps of 3/4-inch plywood, and I attached them using pocket screws. For the rails, I used a 2x8 and ripped it to rough width on the table saw. The width of your rails will depend on the thickness of your slab. The slab I'm flattening in this build is almost 6 inches thick, so I cut the rails to 6.5 inches wide. After ripping the rails to rough width of the table saw, I ran that edge over the jointer to ensure it was perfectly flat. If you don't have a jointer, you can either use a hand plane to flatten this edge, or just hope that your table saw left you with a straight enough edge. Once I had one edge jointed, I ripped the rails to final width at the table saw. With the sled finished, I headed over to my buddy Ryan's shop, where we'd be flattening and finishing the slab. Before flattening, I shimmed up the slab so that any rocking was removed, and then we used the router to clean up the channel in the bottom of the sled. We noticed that the rails were a little unstable here, so we attached a 2x4 between each end of the rails, and this really helped to stabilize things. The router bit I'm using to flatten this slab is this monster of a bit from Infinity Tools. It has a 2-inch cutting diameter, 1-inch cutting depth. I'll have a link to the exact bit in the video description if you want to check it out. I'd highly recommend using it for any router flattening project. With everything set up, I set the depth of the router to take about 1/4 inch off and started flattening. I made the initial pass standing in the direct path of all the chips coming off the router and ended up tearing up my shins. On the second pass, I moved to one side of the jig, and Ryan and I passed the router back and forth. This worked much better. We needed to make quite a few passes on the bottom of the slab to get it flat, but once it was, we flipped it over to work on the top. Before flattening the top of the slab, I needed to rip off about 1 inch from each of the rails so that the bit could get enough depth to fully flatten the top. We did also try using a collet extension to give the bit a little more depth, but it ended up getting bent when the bit caught during one of the passes. Once the sled was back in business, we got to flattening the top of the slab. This only took one pass, but we did get a little impatient and we're probably taking off about 1/2 inch of depth on this pass. Amazingly enough, this router and bit combo didn't have any trouble and left a super clean surface. While we're flattening, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's video, John C. Campbell Folk School. I recently had the opportunity to attend a week-long woodworking class at the school, and it was an amazing experience. John C. Campbell is located in Brasstown, North Carolina, about 2 hours from Atlanta, Knoxville, and Asheville, so it's centrally located to many places in the Southeast. They have classes on everything from woodworking to blacksmithing to drawing and much more. To learn more, visit their website at folkschool.org or check out the link in the video description below. With the slab flattened, we needed to clean up the absolutely ridiculous amount of sawdust before moving on. If you're going to flatten a slab like this, you absolutely need to wear a respirator. The dust this process produced was insane. I think we filled about 4 of these 33-gallon trash bags full of dust. Once the shop was a little cleaner, we started cleaning up the edges of the slab. There was quite a bit of rotten sapwood and bark on the edges of the slab, and I just knocked these pieces off with a chisel and mallet. After removing all the loose pieces, Ryan cleaned up the edges using a belt sander. As you might have noticed, this slab has a pretty massive crack running down the center. To stabilize the slab, we decided to add a bow tie key, sometimes called a Dutchman or butterfly. I cut the bow tie out of a scrap piece of walnut off camera using my bandsaw, and then traced the outline of the bow tie onto the top of the slab. Next, I used a trim router with a 1/4 inch up/down cut spiral bit to clear out most of the waste. With the majority of the waste removed, I cleaned up the walls of the pocket using a 1-inch chisel. Since I got so close to my lines with the router, I could chisel right to my line and get a nice clean fit with the bow tie. After dry fitting the bow tie, I added glue and pounded it home using a mallet. Once the glue had dried, I came back with a plane to flush up the bow tie, and I only brought my smoothing plane with me to Ryan's shop, which probably wasn't the best choice, but it still only took a few minutes to flush it up. Next, Ryan sanded the slab, first using a belt sander to remove any of the big router marks, and then switching to a random orbit sander. And while he's sanding, let's take a second to talk about the other sponsor of this week's video, ecomfort.com. The summer heat has been making it really tough to stay out in the shop, so I reached out to the folks at eComfort, a retailer specializing in home heating, venting, and cooling. We found an LG mini split unit that was perfect for my shop space, and I had it installed by an HVAC technician in my area. To see a more in-depth video on the installation process, check out the video on my second channel, and to learn more about eComfort, visit the link in the video description below. Once we were finished sanding, it was time to apply finish. We went with a simple Danish oil finish, as we wanted the natural look of the wood to really show through. We applied 2 coats, letting the oil soak into the wood for about 30 minutes between coats, and wiped off any excess that remained on the surface. With the slab done, it was time to build the base, and I actually built the base in my shop before heading over to Ryan's, since we only had a limited amount of time there. For the base, I kept it really simple and just made a modern looking base using 2x4s. First, I cut the pieces to length, and I'll have a cut list available in the blog post that will go along with this build, which will be linked to in the video description. After cutting the pieces to length, I ran them through my planer just to clean them up, and this is a totally optional step and you could skip it if you don't have a planer. With the faces nice and clean, I decided to rip off the round over on each edge of the 2x4s, which I did on the table saw. To assemble the base, I used pocket holes. The way the base is designed makes it so that none of the pocket holes are visible in the final piece, so you don't have to fill these holes later on. I did run into one issue during assembly. I didn't think about the fact that planing the 2x4s would make the standard 2.5-inch pocket screws that you typically use with dimensional lumber like this a little bit too long, so I had to switch to regular 2-inch panhead screws. These ended up working fine, but it's something to keep in mind. To further reinforce each corner, I added 1 power head screw to each corner, using Fastcap's flush mount drill bit to countersink the screws. Next, I needed to attach the stretchers that connected the legs to each other. I centered the stretchers on the legs and then clamped them in place, making sure I was on a flat surface, my table saw in this case. With the stretcher clamped in place, I added 2.5-inch pocket screws to secure the stretcher in place, and I repeated this step for the other stretcher. After assembly, I sanded the base thoroughly with 120 grit then 180 grit sandpaper. For the finish, I added a few coats of black spray paint. I really like how the grain pattern shows through on the base. I think it gives an awesome textured look. To attach the base to the slab, I used a few 2.5-inch screws, making sure to slightly widen the holes in the base to allow for wood movement. Finally, I added some felt pads to the bottom of the base off camera, and the table was done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a lot of work, but I really love the way it came out. That router flattening jig just makes an incredible mess, but it really does a good job getting this surface nice and flat. This was basically just part of a tree that was cut down in my buddy Ryan's neighborhood. He's the one who built this slab table with me, and I think it turned out absolutely beautiful. So if you guys like this project, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this every Tuesday. I also have links to all the tools and materials I use in the video description below. And last, I want to say a big thanks to all my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. I have a list of my $10 and up patrons on the screen. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Until next week, happy building.